Okay, well, it doesn't sound like Mark's here. Maybe he's having some internet trouble as well. But Edmund, should we go ahead and start doing the report outs?
I think so, for the sake of time.
Okay, well, let's go ahead and do that then, and I can get this moving until Mark is able to join us again. So I think first we were going to start with coordination opportunities breakouts, and we actually had two of these because so many people were interested. So Avery and Molly, do you want to kick us off?
Sure. So the coordination group number 1 talked quite a bit about both prioritizing scientific research, like setting scientific research priorities, and then also we discussed coordinating funding. So in terms of which aspects of the science enterprise need the most coordination, our conversation really centered around prioritization and then funding. And with regard to prioritization, we talked about the need to coordinate both at a global level, like across the co-equal goals and delta as place, and also within specific resource areas. And then with regard to coordinating funding, there was a pretty strong consensus that funding arrangements sort of drive the science, and so they can either encourage or discourage coordination. And so I know that there was another breakout group that talked about funding, but our conversation sort of centered around the need to have more coordination in relation to funding. We discussed the science action agenda as an example of a way that management questions can be prioritized for researchers at sort of a high level across the Delta. The group discussed how there are trade-offs when management questions get sort of rolled up into a higher level, or when they get translated into a request for proposals, and that some of the details might be lost. So researchers could end up submitting proposals that match the request, but may not actually answer a specific management question. And so there was a discussion about how to try to bridge that gap. We talked about a lot of different ideas. Those included retaining detailed management questions for reference within the science action agenda. That was one very specific idea. Other ideas included organizing funding applications so that, sorry, I think there's some background noise happening. Another idea was to organize funding applications so that researchers get awarded more points if they demonstrate that they will be coordinating with other researchers or with stakeholders. It was noted that this can raise some challenges with regard to stakeholder capacity, and that sometimes stakeholders also need to be compensated for the time that they spend coordinating with researchers. So that might be a challenge with a model like that. But we also talked about potentially requiring that a percentage of the budget within a funding agreement be allocated for specifically for coordination between investigators and a manager or managers who will use the information. And then moving into sort of examples of effective coordination, we talked about the DPIIC being a good model, but there was also some discussion about kind of the trade-offs between having really high-level decision makers in the room to coordinate versus sort of working level managers who have more time and capacity to directly coordinate with researchers. We talked about the DELHAC, the Delta Levy, oh, I'm gonna get this acronym wrong, habitat, sorry, the DELHAC as a potential model for coordinating between regulators and practitioners, as well as bringing the science into projects. And then we talked about the Delta Nutrient Research Plan as a nice model to build sort of a shared understanding about what different managers are dealing with in the Delta and their management questions that they're hoping science can respond to. Let's see. Oh, and there was also a model, a national level model from a earthquake hazard reduction program, in which there was a common prospectus developed that made the program goals very clear, so that there was a way to review proposals to ensure that they really spoke to the prospectus, and that everything was sort of coordinated in response to that prospectus. And then I think with regard to the changes needed to achieve coordination goals, again, we talked about different funding arrangements that could better incentivize coordination between managers and researchers. So some of those I already touched on, but the group really emphasized the need to incentivize researchers to spend time on that coordination. And we also talked about the benefits of symposia or informal or formal meetings among researchers and managers within a specific resource area to be able to get together and talk about cutting edge research, current issues and research needs, and how those can be pushed forwards. I think that's it. I apologize for the scattered recap, but I didn't have much time to prep. If anyone else from the group has anything else to add, please feel free to chime in.
This is Lisa. No, nothing to add. I would just say that you and Molly did a great job of capturing a lot of information. Thank you.
Thanks, Lisa.
So
It was
hi,
a very
all.
lively conversation. Sorry,
Yes,
go
ours
ahead.
was also lively. Did Bruce and Megan have a chance to report on group 2 around coordination activities?
No,
We didn't.
They're next.
Okay, so I had some connectivity issues getting back on, so I'm going to kind of take over the flow from here. So could we hear from Bruce and or Megan, please?
Great, thanks, Mark. And as you would expect, lots of commonality between the group that just reported out, but I'll just hit a few high points and keep this fairly short. In terms of areas needing coordination, which was our first question, 3 areas specifically emerged, although there were others. The first was anywhere you have kind of complex interdisciplinary problems that really need multiple, disciplinary skills is certainly one area that needs coordination. But also the second was just across agencies or across entities. We've obviously got lots of situations where people are doing work in different organizations on similar issues, and there's a need to cross across those different silos, even within organizations. And then the third area, which I thought was pretty insightful, was the need to coordinate not just amongst ourselves as professionals in the field, but with private landowners, with local organizations, and with NGOs, and the need to really coordinate and communicate with folks that are on the ground or maybe don't have the level of resources or capacity to stay engaged at the level that we all do, and there's a real need there to keep them connected. So those were the 3 areas of coordination I recorded. In terms of mechanisms to really promote coordination, I'll also hit 3. The first was just relationships and trust building, that just the value of the interaction and creating opportunities to build relationships over time. A second was we talked a lot about the value of a physical location, something like the proposed Rivers location, or even, historically UC Davis and the Romberg-Tiburon Center have kind of served as these collaboratories, if you will, places where people would go specifically to collaborate and to coordinate, to kind of serve as clearinghouses. But the real value of physically being in a place was emphasized by the group, even just from a logistics standpoint. Right now, we have a lot of our research capability is pretty fragmented in terms of its locations, and there'd be some real value in some consolidation. The third item, as far as mechanisms, were just venues for coordination, and there's lots of good venues out there, but just emphasizing that those are really great ways to promote coordination, sharing, understanding. And as a specific example, the science programs initiative that's just started to develop this science tracker. It's not a physical venue per se, but it's a place where people could go and access information and see what different people are doing and just promote more collaboration. So the third question had to do where we need changes or where change is needed. And again, I'm just going to hit on the top three. The first was funding, and that's been mentioned by the previous group, so I won't dwell on that, but there's just a real need for, to rethink some of how we're funding some of this activity, the need to promote coordination, create incentives for that, as well as support directed actions that might encourage participation by multiple entities. So that's funding, that's number one. The second was a comment about mandates and just being very clear about what our goals and objectives are, and for there to be a mandate for coordination is very helpful. It's some kind of forcing function. And then the last, and certainly not the least, in terms of areas for change, is the need to invest in people and positions that will really carry out this coordination. It's a unique skill set, sometimes a unique position. And if it's not made part of somebody's duty statement, sometimes it just doesn't happen. And a part of that also relates back to funding. Sometimes we fund these positions, they have limited timeframes. And so for continuity and longevity, they need to be more than, kind of soft money type funded positions, but something that's a little more long-term. So I'll stop there, Mark.
Great, thank you very much. Just for people's reference, this is about 4.5 minutes, so that's a great length of time to be able to get the discussion through the discussion, have time for additional questions and more group discussion. So, in those two sets of comments, we heard a lot about the right people in the room, getting some money attached to them, connecting to community stakeholders as well as are things that we talked about. So those are some themes that are starting to emerge. So why don't we go on to the next group? So the next slide. So money is going to have to be a part of the picture. Sometimes the university scientists work for free, like I'm doing right now, but most of the time we need some more money to get things done. So why don't we turn that over to Amanda or Annie to discuss or to summarize what they heard in their group.
Great, thanks, Mark. And we do appreciate you using some of your sabbatical time to be assisting with this and to be an integral part of this, so thank you. So we discussed funding, and we kicked off the conversation by talking about some, examples of successful fund allocation, and when we do have some good examples, especially around collaboration and coordination, and in particular, the joint funding solicitation between the Stewardship Council, Reclamation, CDFW, and a lot of things are working really well there. But then on the flip side, recognized, very quickly also that there are a lot of mechanistic barriers to funding. And I think it was Michael George that kind of summed it up, I think, the whole conversation really well, is that, we have met the enemy and it's us. To paraphrase, and that, we've created so many barriers that we need to clear out, like we need to figure out how to address, and that these self-made barriers are really causing us to waste time, on contracting, reporting, transferring funds, applying, and that so many scientists are having to really kind of spend a lot more of their time away from the actual science and trying to figure out how to actually get the funding to do the science that we want them to do for the system. And it's really, and this has the consequence of really kind of limiting our ability to be adaptive and forward-looking, which is what we're here to be, talking about today. And so, we talked both in terms of the short term and the long term. In the short term, we really do need to start addressing some of the mechanics of funding. Again, as I mentioned, looking at what we can do to simplify contracting, to simplify the application process, to simplify so many other aspects of just the mechanics of getting funding to agencies and then getting funding to the scientists that need it to use it. And then in the long term, we need to start getting more innovative and efficient with our funding and to create and develop new sources of funding. So in terms of how to be more innovative, maybe start looking at the development of some type of a nonprofit that can allow us to go out to philanthropic sources or other sources to bring more funding into the system and to make it easier for us and to be more nimble in getting the funding out. One example that came up was the Ocean Science Trust that was created by the state, but is an independent 501c3 that works very closely with the Ocean Protection Council. And so they're able to bring in philanthropic dollars to support science in the system. So, a lot of things that we can do now that will help us over the long term, but also starting to think kind of outside the box about how we're funding science and what structures we have for funding science in the Delta. And Annie or any others from the group want to add anything? Okay, I think that's it for funding then.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. So constantly searching from that manna from heaven, so to speak. The Ocean Science Trust is definitely a different type of model than, for example, a JPA that would source funding from its member agencies. And obviously, there's always a desire to go to the state legislature, even the national government, for earmarked funding for these sorts of things. So that, I think that's a quest that will continue. So next up is institutional change. We had two groups around that. I was part of the second group, and we had a very lively discussion there. Some of the same themes, money's there too. So why don't we start with Aaron and or Chelsea to summarize what happened in group one.
Yeah, thank you, Mark. This is Chelsea. Aaron is having some internet issues this morning, so I'm going to step in and do the report out. So our conversation about institutional structure and institutional change focused a lot around what's required to increase meaningful collaboration and coordination. We started the discussion by talking a little bit about accountability and different types of scientific accountability, but particularly being accountable to doing impactful work that then gets translated into decision-making and policy forums. And so I would say I distilled out a few key points that emerged. And the first one is that to increase coordination and accountability within the science enterprise, there are a few different structures that can be used. One is to have some sort of regulatory mandate or instrument, so require coordination. The other is to use a voluntary collaborative structure, but to have a funding incentive to promote collaboration. And then we also talked about the possibility of having some sort of overarching agency that specifically serves to lead these coordination and collaborative efforts. And so we discussed as a model the National Estuary Program, which is administered by the EPA. Another point that Jeff Henderson raised was that we do actually currently have a structure that we could also just kind of dig in on, and that is the structure that is outlined in the Delta plan with the lead scientist in the Delta Science Program and the ISB for guidance. And so for institutional structure or an institutional change, not actually changing, but just kind of doubling down on what we currently have. The second major point that emerged is that, and this was in the context of what we're doing well, we do currently have a lot of collaborative efforts going on. And so we pointed to programs like the IEP or CSAMP and CAMP. But we also talked about how a lot of these collaboratives are operating independently from one another. They don't work together unless there are some key individuals who facilitate those efforts. And so, the question was raised when you do have these big interdisciplinary and integrative questions about something in the Delta, it's not really clear who you go to answer those questions or even who's in charge. And so we discussed a lot the importance of coalition building among various actors in the system. The third point was interest, of course, in this collaboratory idea and the need to further develop and refine it. And then also discussion about what do we mean by collaboration? And collaboration in this kind of deeper, meaningful sense is where you don't just create space for people to talk about ideas, but actually promote sharing and co-production of knowledge and products. The fourth point was kind of a counterpoint to that was that, yes, while we need this kind of upper level collaborative effort, we also do still need to have spaces institutionally for people, more technical people, to do that detailed work, to become their subject matter experts, to have a real grasp on their project, to then promote, when they do get into these collaborative arenas, to promote deep and effective collaborations. The fifth was kind of a more of a suggestion and concrete idea that emerged was discussion about the value of performance measures that have widespread acceptance and buy-in across the Delta. And so we did talk about the current performance measures in the Delta plan as a useful model that might be expanded. And this kind of effort might also be supported with or paired by efforts that set specific strategic goals and develop indicators that are valuable and meaningful to stakeholders. So we discussed the example of a harmful algal bloom indicator in Lake Erie. So they developed a forecasting system about water quality, and that required a lot of collaboration, but it was an issue that was of broad interest throughout the region, and so there was a lot of buy-in to do that work. Sixth point is the need to improve communication in all channels, communication between scientists who are working on similar or even the same projects or problems, communication between scientists and decision makers or policymakers, and then communication between scientists and broader publics. And so one suggestion that emerged was possibly creating more positions for people who specifically serve in a role to facilitate those communications, either to the upper policy levels or outward toward the public. And then finally, of course, coming back to funding, if we are going to add capacity in that or other ways, we have to think about how to support those activities financially. And I will leave it at that unless others have more to add.
Okay, I don't see anybody jumping at the bit there, but so, you know, definitely this idea of the community of individuals that are out there and capable of working together across the boundaries that are established by these various science venues, I think is a really important concept. A community, some people might call that a community practice. It might be around data, it might be around models, it might be around science communication, but across these programs rather than having, you know, within the silos that are currently existing. All right, so let's hear from Harriet in terms of what our group 2 talked about.
Yeah, okay. We also had a very lively discussion, as Mark brought up. Okay, question 1. So the big change, or the area that we see and we discussed about targeting for institutional change, is really the need to step out of the paradigm of only conducting science to address regulatory requirements or science that is responsive to where the funding is coming from, and for agencies or scientists to address their particular values. And while it's important to continue to address those questions, we also talked a lot about how we really need to conduct science to address the issues at hand. And we talked about, or it was suggested that we maybe take a period of time, maybe a year, to focus on science to only address what we actually want to answer and not tie it to funding and addressing regulatory or permitting requirements. So that was question 1. For question 2, we talked a lot about how the people are very passionate in our system, and people care about what we do. And what's really effective is that the people in the organizations are willing and open to change things that don't work. So for example, IEP has done a review of their own data structures and data streams to determine what is missing, what needs to be changed, and they're changing it. So in general, it seems that incremental change is occurring, and maybe not the transformative change that everybody wants, but at least there's a willingness and openness to change to operating more successfully and efficiently. For question 3 and 4, we sort of had one big discussion, so I'm going to talk about the main points for both those questions. And I think the biggest thing that can be improved upon is really that we're not thinking about the system as a whole. And similar to the other institutional change group, you know, there are many groups in the Delta that are collecting data, doing studies to address the issues that each agency is trying to answer, but that the science is not necessarily brought into the same room and discussed together. What does it mean? And there are a lot of these collaborative groups in the Delta, but these groups are not necessarily linked to get a complete picture of what's going on in the entire system as a whole. So each of those efforts are very good, but some coordination between these groups needs to occur. We also talked a little bit about how things in the Delta tend to be driven by litigation, and we could get more done and be more efficient if all actions weren't, if we didn't live in that world of litigation. We also talked about, you know, what we could change and enhance the capacity of the enterprise. We talked about, you know, we can't keep just collecting data and, you know, the more we collect, it'll solve our problems. Like we need to maybe step away from that idea and instead invest in infrastructure to make sense of the data that we've already collected. So we need more coordinated models that have been, you know, bought in by others and created collaboratively so that everyone will use it, and maybe those models, you know, related to ecosystem or hydrologic models could be created together. And along with that, we really need standardized methods to observe the data, and maybe over a larger area, maybe go beyond the Delta in the region. And, you know, we've talked about bold ideas such as studying ecological services on a national level, for example, to inform policy for a broader area. And lastly, we talked about the collaboratory and how, you know, in order to really form something that works, we need a formal visioning process. But that, you know, it's one way to help solve some of the issues, but it won't solve all of our problems in the system. And we talked about, you know, broader coordination between the key folks of various collaborative groups to come together in a purposeful manner to truly collaborate and solve the issues. And again, it all comes down to, you know, having the resources at each of the entities to really make that happen. I think that's all I had. Anything to add from the group?
Okay, great summary. Thank you very much. We did discuss quite a few issues and thinking about the pathway. If there's gonna be a collaboratory, how do we get there? How do we find out the right way to get there? Given the fact that a collaboratory requires, you know, costs to establish, costs to maintain, time, resources to participate in. So how do we make sure that that would be a setup that would work and where the benefits would outweigh the costs? So, all right, the next one, please. Next slide. So where do the leadership come from? So we know we need leaders within organizations, within these different collaborative groups, within the various agencies, within the NGOs, the communities, and the future. So how do we identify them, leverage them now? Who are they? How do we make sure that they are in place in the future? So let's hear from Nancy, what you learned in that group.
Thanks, Mark. The highlights of our discussion, I think, will carry on themes you've already heard. I'm just pulling out points that we heard, and it's going to cover all three questions because we jumped around quite a bit. Most leadership comes from academic institutions because the transitory nature of government doesn't provide the attention span that we need. We should identify within universities a program to be endowed with tenure positions and opportunities to engage graduate students. The McGeorge Law School's now defunct law review that once tracked the California legislature was a good forum for synthesizing and common knowledge. The work of the San Francisco Estuary Institute in recent years in the Delta is a good example of what we need. They work on both the science and the policy side. The Delta ISB is the best example of leadership that we've seen. The Delta Science Program has an overarching mandate to be a leader and has done some great things. We should take a look as perhaps a model at NASA's interdisciplinary teams, which are funded temporarily, meaning perhaps over several fund or to solve specific problems, and though they're independent, self-directing, and report to NASA headquarters, they involve academics and others, and scientists need to compete to be involved. We also discussed DELHAC, the Delta Levee and Habitat Committee, which has been around 30 years, cuts across fish and wildlife regulators and reclamation district managers. The thing that keeps it together is the carrot of money through DWR's Delta Levee programs. Well, another example that was brought up is the Delta Regional Monitoring Program, which brings people together across issues and disciplines. But those familiar with that program noted that it's really important to have facilitation to help people come to agreement and to maintain progress. Others mentioned Sam Luoma's San Francisco Estuary and Watershed Science Journal as a great example of leadership. We need to put together the notion of responsibility and authority in the Delta, create opportunities for people to lead that have authority and funding. We need more niches to fill, and there aren't very many where you have responsibility, authority, funding, and vision coming together. As I think you heard others discuss, there's a real need to get down into the communities, grassroots, to look for champions and leaders and to gain a better understanding of the issues. An example was given of Richard Norgard spending the day in the Delta talking to reclamation district managers and the great exchange of information that came from that as a way to help develop leaders, create visibility for excellent work, offer formal mentorship programs, awards programs, invite people to serve on boards, and synthesis, which is badly needed, naturally creates opportunities for leadership. Academia, with its reward for publishing narrowly focused on research, does not do enough to reward integration or for the making of connections to decision makers. So even though academia offers that independence people say we need, it also doesn't necessarily reward integration at the scale we need. NOAA and the USGS effectively separate science from the regulatory side of their agencies and give scientists independence. State regulatory agencies should consider that model. How money gets used has a direct impact on where leadership emerges and how it evolves. So pay attention to that. Scientists, and you heard this before, scientists need to be able to communicate with many kinds of audiences, including non-scientists. They need to be able to talk to elected leaders. And when you look at how frameworks are created and decisions are made, look at institutions that force scientists to explain themselves to non-scientists. Teach people how to communicate. Communication is a key leadership trait, but communication in and of itself is not the same as leadership. Finally, someone at the highest level, maybe it's the governor, needs to say that we need integration now. Examples of where this has happened before are the California Broadband Council and the California Biodiversity Council. And anyone from our group, feel free to chime in with anything I've missed. Thanks.
Okay, thank you very much. Anybody want to chime in any additional points there?
Yes, I would like to ask if I can give whoever last spoke my phone number. I would like to talk further about leadership or vision, funding, leadership, and authority that I think is at the core of things falling short of what we would like to see.
I'm sure, I think in the chat, you should be able to connect with Nancy Vogel. That's who was speaking. So you might try that.
Nancy Vogel, is she at the Delta Stewardship Council?
CNRA. I'm actually sorry, I'm not quite California Natural Resources Agency. So yeah, okay, that's that acronym, right? CNRA.
That's right.
Yeah. So I expect that you could find her online if you can't operate in the chat.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you. So we heard a lot of interesting things. You know, the leadership requiring training. I do think that is something that is important. Where that training occurs is definitely an interesting question. We do have like the Water Education Foundation's Water Leaders Program, but maybe something that should be scaled up. And of course, if you would like to endow a university to do such things, we'd be happy to talk about receiving such an endowment to work on such things. Although I definitely do not think, and I know Jay would back me up, we should not be looking to the university or university professors to be anything like the saving grace here. It's people like me mostly learn from people outside of the university rather than the other way around, it seems to me lots of times. All right, so last one, I think we got one more, right? Data management. So I'll be interested to hear how much of the discussion here is about open data and how to link the data, but also other aspects of the scientific workflow, modeling, which is something we talked about in my thinking of the different programs out there, sensors, different sensors that are out there that are collecting data and modeling data in various ways. How do we get those the elements of that workflow to come together? So why don't we let Sarah come up with the summary for that?
Okay, thank you, Mark. So around the first question, successful examples, I think although systems could always be stronger and more effective, I think there was a general consensus that the community has made a lot of positive strides. There were examples like USGS data management systems, the Environmental Data Initiative. We also referenced tools like GitHub and Tableau. There were a number of different very specific examples that participants included in the chat, so we'll save those. So those are available for people after the session. We also talked about informal data sharing, and there was some good, robust discussion around whether trust is growing. I think generally consensus that scientists are working together more informally, more willing to share data, and that funders requiring data analysis plans and publicly facing data is making a positive difference. And that more of that should be, well, I'll talk in a minute about how accountability for making that data publicly available is still an open question, though, and there may be some room for improvement there. Around the second question, examples of large enterprise scale data systems, there was some talk about sort of striving for that perfect kind of holy grail system, and I think a general consensus that there aren't a lot of tremendous examples out there that many enterprises are making slow measured progress, but that there is still a lot of work all around the country. We talked about the importance of using analogous examples from across disciplines and industries. So for example, the group talked briefly about GenBank and the possibility of, even though this is a different, more targeted system, what could we learn from that kind of sharing at an international level? We also talked about USGS ecosystem climate systems and about some of the advances at UC San Diego in terms of allowing for more supercomputing power, big data, and again, a lot of specific examples were included in the chat. We talked about the challenges of consistency and the balancing act between trying to get common vocabulary and metadata understandings without over-policing and discouraging the kind of data integration that's critical. Let's see, somebody said data doesn't interpret itself. We need really good tools to connect data, and we also need to be having conversations about why we collect the data we collect, when we use it for sort of broad analysis, and when we're trying to target particular hypotheses or respond to particular hypotheses. In terms of some of the ideas around question 3, the group discussed having a data center to pull together various information in a usable way, and integrating that data. There was talk about the importance of keeping the end, not only the producers, but the end users of that data in mind. And so what are the decisions that policymakers, that managers need to make with the data they have? And so what would that suggest about not only the type of data that's produced, but the way that it's integrated and shared. The group talked about citizen science opportunities briefly, talked about some of the difficulties too in holding grantees accountable for sharing data, and the possibility that even though there are more grant requirements, that agencies are not necessarily holding grantees responsible for making data publicly available or sharing it, and so suggesting that ought to be built in more clearly to grant criteria, and that there ought to be sanctions, lack of funding for organizations that don't share effectively. And finally, people talked about, because in the age of big data, there's such a hunger for learning, the possibility of a Delta Data School, where people at various points in their careers, but especially early in their careers, could learn techniques and take workshops and share their data analysis and tools. And so there were a few examples given, and then we ended talking about the challenges of and the importance of allowing for experimentation and mistakes, but then the challenges of working with provisional data. And so that balancing act between encouraging experimentation, but also helping data users, producers, and the public understand what provisional data really means and how to manage that. I see some definite analogies to COVID and what we're seeing around study there. So that was a pretty high level summary, and so jump in with specific examples. I invite you to do so, and then Ted also took excellent notes.
Okay, excellent. Anybody else from that group want to say something in addition? Okay, so I mean, I definitely appreciate, it's one of the things that's quite interesting in all of these groups is that people are nominating models of programs or from the Delta or other places in the world or the country that are doing things that we would like to do. So that we definitely need to make sure we have our collection of examples down as part of our overall process. And also in this group, you know, linking to things around the emerging standards around collaborative science and open data standards and software development, and bringing that more strongly into the architecture of the system seems to be an important step forward. So we have about 10 minutes left in this overall plenary discussion, and I would like to open it up now to questions and or statements that people would like to make with respect to anything that they've heard, their main take-home messages that you think we should focus on. If you have the magic wand, please let us have it. Anything that we missed, Jay wrote in the chat that if you have examples of successful coordination and funding programs, institutional changes, please put them in the chat, because we can make sure our note takers will record them. So I'll open it up. I'll try to see if there's any hands up. Or put it in the chat if you have a statement or question. Surely with 86 experienced, passionate people with strong opinions, there's certainly somebody who would like to say something. Don't be shy.
Well, should I say something and when no one else is saying anything?
Yeah.
Hi, this is John Bechtel. I was explaining at the breakout that my entree into this conference is from a long time ago, with me being a veteran of the UC Davis hydraulics lab when we built the model for the Sacramento River and demonstrated the peripheral canal diversion, or the diversion for the peripheral canal, and revealed some of the problems that would be resulting from that. And reflecting on it and the time in the 70s when it seemed like there was more solidarity or maybe coordination or consistency. And I'm not sure what happened between then and now to where we're having the conversations that we're having today. And I wonder if there was a particular character at UC Davis by the name of Amorocho, who was an international figure in land, air, and water resources. And I wonder if his dynamics are what characterized what was happening in terms of those resources in the 70s. And if there are any leading figures today that would have such a championship role in being able to bring in Governor Brown at the time, or bring in the federal, the congressman and such. And do we have somebody like that today? Am I off the point? And I just wanted to start the conversation along the lines of the boldness that the last that was on the chat.
Yeah, clearly we need leadership here, and finding such people to provide that type of integration and to give it the sort of political visibility that it needs, I think it is quite important. I would offer a hypothesis about why things are more complicated now. We have a lot more problems that have emerged over the years, and it seems every new problem gets a new forum, so that leads to a multiplication of forums. I saw a hand up. Was that Darcy?
Yeah, that was me. And you were starting to get to this, and I'm wondering, we've talked about it in a number of ways. How do we get this information into something that's actionable? And because I would hate for all of this effort, and in the paper that you guys sent out, it was outlined really well of all these different workshops and forums that we've talked about this. So how do we create that change? We have all the information, I'm assuming. I don't think there's any one magic bullet in any of this information. So how do we take that next step? It's huge, but how can we get there? And that's not specifically for you, Mark.
Yeah, well, I mean, that is the charge for us, I think, to try to pick up that gauntlet in our science needs assessment and try to say something as concrete as we can about that. Whether or not we will succeed, all the ingredients and in the sense for such a meal have been laid out in this workshop and discussions leading up to it. So our cupboard is quite full. Can we make a meal of it? It remains to be seen. And then delivering that meal to somebody like the governor, or the right sort of legislative committees, I think is going to be an important piece of the puzzle. And there's plenty of people in the room right now with pathways to such individuals who can elevate the political visibility of any types of actionable items. So any other people want to make some comments or offer examples? Past experience is great. To hear the old word, the peripheral canal, come up again. I like to talk about that in my water policy class, how the term for delta conveyance has changed over the years.
Mark, this is Susan.
Sure.
One thing that comes to mind for me is this has been a tremendous workshop, and my brain is a little overloaded and overwhelmed. But what I'm thinking right now is I don't have a clear picture of the critical path and what happens if we don't take that critical path. I have a lot of concepts and ideas, and I heard various priorities. I think it would be useful to focus on what is our critical path. Your question of how do we need to change the structure? I don't remember your exact wording. What do we need to do in the science enterprise to meet the future management decisions? And so we have some management questions and management decisions that are being refined, thanks to all the work from the folks who were working through our management questions. But I think in order to answer the question of how to change the structure, I need to know what is our critical path and what happens to us if we don't follow that path. What are the milestones and the key points that determine where we go?
Yes, I greatly appreciate that. It's like, you know, we're going to move into our group science needs assessments deliberations, and ideally, maybe we would like to throw out what that map looks like, but also we may not be enough. Maybe we need to, another step still needs to be taken about finding the right map makers and getting them to help deliver that vision and what that map looks like to illuminate that path going forward. I very much agree with that idea. I have Steve Brandt up to provide a comment, and then I'm going to turn it over to Jay to send us off so we don't become zombies.
Yeah, I just wanted to follow up on those comments about the right path. We talked about this a little bit in our group, and it's sort of like maybe it's a symptom of what we're trying to solve. And I think that if one were to come up with an absolute brilliant scientific scheme to come up with a tool that would that managers would need, and that it would save lives across the Delta, let's say, but it would require the collaboration and resources from a number of agencies to make it happen. If you had that idea or had that concept, who do you go to? Where would you start? Where is the primary scientific entity that could lead this sort of an effort? And I don't know if there's an answer to that. I don't know if it's DPIIC. I don't know if it's something else, but and maybe that's part of the symptom we're trying to explore opportunities for, to set up a structure in such a way so that those kind of things can happen. And who this report, for example, might be the logical target for.
Yeah, DPIIC is interesting. I was thinking about it myself. You know, DPIIC has the charge, at least my cartoon view of it, of coordinating the agencies, but maybe it's not the agencies that we need to coordinate, but it's rather the scientists and leaders that are within the community across all the different programs that need some more coordination and discussion and network building and community building. So, Jay, would you like to provide some closing remarks?
Thank you very much, Mark, and thank you very much to everybody for your organization and ideas. I think today, like yesterday, had a very rich set of ideas and concerns coming up. This is going to be a monumental task to try to digest and try to put into a document. So our next steps will be, we're going to have a couple of hours of debriefing today, this afternoon, for the organizers to try to distill some points out of this and some digestion of what's been said. The writing group for the science needs assessment will probably come up with a draft report. I'd like to have this done sometime late in this calendar year, in this new water year. And I'm sure we will get lots of very useful and interesting feedback from that draft report. And hopefully we will take the time to walk that draft report around, or zoom it around, I suppose, in this disturbed time, to get some reactions, and then hopefully have a final report to DPIIC sometime in early 2021. This is clearly a messy and a long kind of topic. I was seeing that we had to have a picture for the last slide, and so I came across this one of Sisyphus for women's suffrage back in Victorian England, and it seems somehow appropriate that we're in a struggle here, I think, where we know that we have to make some changes in how we organize and coordinate and integrate science and communicate science for the Delta. It's a very difficult thing to do. Just technically, it's very hard, almost impossible thing to do sociologically. But it's a worthy cause, and it's going to become increasingly important as the Delta continues to change in important ways. So although we'll have a lot of impediments in both thinking about it and coming up with a report, and certainly in terms of implementing anything that comes out of the report, it's a struggle that I think ultimately has to be successful, at least more successful than what we're doing today. So we don't really have the choice of giving up. So I think I will end it there. Oh, except for mentioning that if you have further comments, we'd be very interested in seeing them. Please send them to the DISB at deltacouncil.ca.gov email address. Really look forward to seeing more of your ideas over time, and then hopefully we'll have something for you to react to late in this year, in this calendar year.
Okay, thank you, Jay. Thank you to all the participants. And I think at this point, right, Amanda, we will close the workshop.
Yeah, I think we're good. Thank you all so much for participating, and I think we'll be following up with all of you, and look forward to hearing your comments on the draft report.
Thank you all tremendously, and we look forward to your comments along the way.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thanks, Mark. Thanks, Amanda.